Focus on Headline. Now let's take a look at what major issues are making the headlines today on Focus on Headline. For this, joining us in the studio today, we have our Friday reporters in Changana and Hong Seung-Yeon. Guys, welcome back.
Good evening.
Good evening to you guys. It's been a few days since the end of the polls for the general elections, but still, a number of news regarding the outcomes of the 22nd general elections coming out today. As we've mentioned, the main opposition Democratic Party scoring a landslide victory in the general elections, dealing a resounding blow not only to the ruling PPP but to President Yoon Suk Yeol, falling just short of a super majority. Remember, with the combined figures, it was something around, I believe, 186. If you add the satellite party and then, of course, Choguk's party. And I guess if you add, according to what Lee Jun-suk has been saying, if you add his party too, maybe it's a higher number there. But still, it is not a supermajority. President Yoon humbly accepting the results of the elections, pledging to announce his plans to renew the administration and the state affairs. Also, he has mentioned that the top office has mentioned that he's going to make some sort of statement in regards to the recent election result. Hannah, you're going to start us off with the latest updates. What do you have for us?
Sure. Now, given the gravity of the issue, the Yoon administration will issue a carefully considered, detailed, and refined plan on how it will govern after the general election. President Yoon issued his first official response to the election results on the morning of the 11th, but it was a short message as it was so soon after the election. And Yoon will review the renewed plans over the weekend and is expected to announce the details of the government overhaul, which will focus on listening to the voices raised by the general public and strengthening communication. However, rather than resetting core domestic agendas such as education, pension, labor, and healthcare reform, the government is expected to announce that it will proceed in a way to better communicate with the public on the progress of national reforms and gain public consensus. Now, a press conference is reportedly under consideration as there have been many criticisms of Yoon's one-sided communication since his defeat in the general election. In fact, President Yoon has not held a press conference since his 100th day in office on August 17, 2022, which is why former presidents who have spoken directly to the public are also mentioned. Now, other options reportedly include opening up other types of meetings, including cabinet meetings, to the public as a way of communicating directly with the president's own words.
That's right. So President Yoon did technically, I guess, communicate with the public if you count the 24 or so public government debate, right, on livelihoods policy. But when it comes to addressing the nation, it's a completely different thing. If you remember at the start of President Yoon's administration, at the start of his office, he did the store stepping, which actually did not last too long, given some of the controversies surrounding that. But because of this crushing defeat by the ruling PPP, there's been some, I guess, officials, cabinet members who have offered to resign, but also growing calls by others saying that there needs to be some reshuffling going on in the cabinet. Do we have any announcements regarding that?
Well, yes, indeed. Now, Yoon is reportedly working on a reorganization plan as well, given that Prime Minister Han Duck-soo and all senior presidential advisors to Yoon, except those in charge of security issues, expressed their intention to resign. Although Yoon's office didn't immediately say whether Yoon accepted their resignations, however, it is expected that a decision will be made soon since a political vacuum will likely be created if all the resignations are accepted without appointing a successor. Now, the next Prime Minister and Chief Presidential Secretary are expected to be heavyweight politicians who can advise the president and communicate with the National Assembly. The Prime Minister in particular needs to be confirmed by the National Assembly, so the government is reportedly looking for a suitable candidate, including former and current lawmakers who are not opposed by the ruling and opposition parties. Now, once the Prime Minister and Chief Secretary are finalized, there is also the possibility of replacing 5 5 or 6 ministers to shake up the government. And this will likely be accompanied by a reorganization of the presidential office. Now, to accurately represent the people's wants and needs, some argue that the role of the senior secretary to the president for civil affairs should be resumed, or since it was abolished under the current government, there should be a replacement to perform the same role under a different name. In particular, it will be interesting to see whether the two key organizations of the presidential office will be significantly strengthened. And there have been many criticisms in political circles, and there is also public opinion that the office of the Minister for Special Affairs should be revived to strengthen communication with the National Assembly.
So, a suitable candidate who are not opposed by the ruling and opposition parties. Now, if you remember at the start of the Yoon administration, Han Duck-soo was named the prime minister because of the consensus that Han Duck-soo would not be Prime Minister Han Duck-soo, and now the, I guess, soon-to-be former Prime Minister Han Duck-soo was not going to be opposed by the main opposition Democratic Party, because if you remember back in 2007, he actually served as a prime minister for the then liberal Roh Moo-hyun administration. And so that was kind of a surprise to many people that someone who served under a former president who really symbolizes, the liberal side, the progressiveness, progressive politics, to come to the conservative side. But that was, again, to kind of show a neutrality and to kind of work together. And so we'll find out who it is. But another statement that came out, speaking of reshuffling, I think this also caught a lot of people off guard, is An Chul-soo, who is a PPP lawmaker who also won his Bundang district, right? I believe it was the Bundang A district over Lee Kwang-jae. He has come out saying that there needs to be the cabinet members all resigning from their posts because of this crushing defeat. And so what does that entail? Does that also mean that he has other plans at hand moving forward? We'll have to see. In the meantime, let's move on to the economy. South Korea's central bank, not surprising here, maintained its key interest rate unchanged for the 10th consecutive session on Friday, once again reaffirming its commitment to a restrictive monetary policy in light of the persistent concerns about high inflation, not to mention the household debt. Singyeon, let's get more on this.
Sure. As widely anticipated, the Bank of Korea kept its policy rate steady at 3.5%. And this decision follows a series of rate freezes initiated last February, with the BOK refraining from adjustments after implementing 7 consecutive rate hikes from April 2022 to January 2023. And the decision to hold the rate reflects ongoing inflationary pressures in the fourth largest economy in Asia, alongside signs of export recovery. And despite expectations for continued economic growth and a gradual slowdown in core inflation, the central bank remains cautious, emphasizing the need to maintain a restrictive monetary policy until there's confidence that the inflation is approaching the target level of 2%. And persistent inflation, coupled with uncertainty surrounding global monetary policies, not to mention exchange rate fluctuations and geopolitical risk, led policymakers to temper their hopes for a rapid inflation slowdown. And inflationary pressures persisted last year, following a period of sharp inflation in 2022, with March witnessing consumer prices rising over 3% for the second consecutive month, driven by record fruit prices and escalating global oil prices. And while there was a brief dip in inflation below 3% in January, the resurgence of high prices for fruits, agricultural products, and energy reignited inflationary concerns. And elevated oil prices, hovering around $90 per barrel, alongside robust inflation in the United States, contribute to the central bank's cautious stance on rate cuts.
If you guys remember, there was the brief moment, as mentioned here, where inflation was finally seeming to be under control, and it was around, I believe, 2.5%. But the BOK at the time, they kept the the key interest rates unchanged because they're saying, well, it's still way above our target goal of 2% inflation. And in fact, the 2% inflation is something that the U.S. Fed is also pushing for as well. But also the Bank of Korea said, listen, I mean, there's still a lot of uncertainties right now. We don't know what's going to happen. And this is exactly what happened. The agricultural prices skyrocketing, the tensions on the Middle East, especially because of the fact that here in South Korea, the benchmark global oil, benchmark global oil is from the Middle East. It's the Dubai crude. And so because of escalating tensions in the Middle East, you're seeing oil prices skyrocket. It's actually, the Dubai crude is actually moving up a lot faster and higher than the West Texas Intermediate, which is why the gas prices has been just out of control at this time here. But the central bank does remain vigilant regarding the high household debts. We could further weaken domestic demand. Let's also get more on this again.
Sure. Although household loans decreased in March for the first time in 11 months, the overall debt level remains substantial. And according to BOK data, banks' outstanding household debt totaled 1,098.6 trillion won, or around $806 billion as of the end of March, and this is down 1.6 trillion won from the previous month. So the decision to maintain the rate also reflects concerns about potential disruptions in project financing and their adverse effects on financial institutions and domestic demand. And this stance aligns with the Federal Reserve's recent decision to hold its benchmark lending rate steady, hinting at a possible end to its rate hiking cycle. And despite challenges, South Korea's exports show resilience, supported by strong chip performance, resulting in a trade surplus for the country for the 10th consecutive month. And while economic growth slowed last year, forecasts for this year suggest modest expansion, with the central bank acknowledging the potential for growth to meet or exceed estimates.
Yeah, I think the Asian Development Bank came out recently saying that they forecast South Korea's growth to be something like 2.2%, which is it's modest. It's not high. But the household debt is becoming a big problem right now. I read an article recently, and this holds true for a lot of people out there who bought houses during the peak of the FOMO, right? If you don't buy a house now, everyone, this is the lowest price you're going to be able to get it. And they're actually paying more on interest than on principal. Is what's happening right now. But household debt is one problem, but outstanding debt overall, credit card debts are becoming a problem too, because they're saying people are using credit cards to pay off their mortgage bills, and then they're using their those other loans to pay off their credit card loans.
Revolving?
Yeah, so they're revolving, but they're using other loans to do it, right? Instead of the same kind of credit system there for credit cards. But it's a big problem at this time. And we've talked about signals that the high household debt is eventually going to be a bigger problem moving forward. And we mentioned this 2 years ago. And 2 years moving forward, it's surpassing the 1 trillion mark here. Korean economy was recently judged by the government to be in the state of recovery, with manufacturing, production, and exports picking up pace. But sectoral differences persist. For example, weak domestic demand. Hannah, let's get more on this.
Sure. Now, the Ministry of Strategy and Finance said in its recent economic trends, aka the Green Book, released on Friday, that the recovery trend centered on manufacturing, production, and exports has continued with a high level of employment. However, there are differences in the pace of recovery by different economic sectors, such as slowing goods consumption and weak leading indicators for construction. The manufacturing, production, and exports have shown a solid recovery due to the improving semiconductor industry. And in February, manufacturing production increased 5.1% from a year earlier, marking the 7th consecutive month of growth. The value of exports last month was 3.1% higher than a year ago, but in contrast, retail sales, a measure of goods consumption, were only 0.9% slower in February than the same month last year. Service sector output continued to grow, rising 4.5% 1.5% and 1.2% from a year earlier in January and February, respectively. And commodity prices are also something to keep an eye on. Now, the average price of Dubai crude averaged $84.2 per barrel last month, an increase from January to February. And the increase was due to the decline in exports from major oil producers and the attack on Russian refineries. Domestic gasoline and diesel prices also continued to rise last month as a result of higher international oil prices. Consumer prices have also been affected. Last month, consumer prices rose 3.1% from a year earlier, driven by the staggering effect of higher international oil prices in February and stronger prices for fruits and other agricultural products. Now, agricultural product prices jumped 20.5%, while petroleum prices rose 1.2%, marking the first upturn in 14 months since January last year. The government said that the trend of slowing inflation has been less imminent and uncertainties persist, including geopolitical risks and volatility in commodity prices. It stressed that it will focus on a balanced recovery, including vulnerable sectors such as domestic demand, while taking all-out measures to stabilize prices as soon as possible.
So we've been seeing skyrocketing dollar value, right? The South Korean won has been sinking quite a lot actually against the greenback. It's currently let's see, single dollar is worth 1,379 won.
Wow.
It actually went up quite a bit. Now it results in a mixed, I guess, sentiment amongst market experts, because higher dollar actually works well for the export figures, right? When you're exporting a lot of these goods, whether it be automobiles, chips, and so forth, you're being paid in dollars. And so when the dollar is going up, the export figure, if you base it on the amount, the money that comes in, it's going to go up. However, South Korea also relies heavily on energy, right? From importing energy. And when the Dubai crude right now is currently standing at $89.79 a barrel, with the higher dollar value, that means we're actually paying more for the oil there. And so you're going to see, again, increase in the energy prices. That's going to lead to more inflation. Even bringing in imports for even, fruits is going to lead to it doesn't really help out much, right? Because we are paying everything in dollars right now, which is why the dependence on a dollar doesn't help many countries, especially South Korea, which is very heavily dependent on imports for energy. Let's move on here. According to Statistics Korea on Friday, South Korea experiencing its lowest job growth in 3 years in March, primarily due to a high base effect and weak employment in the agricultural sector due to adverse weather conditions. Singyeon, let's get more on this.
Sure. While the manufacturing sector saw continuous job expansion for 4 months, particularly driven by the recovering semiconductor industry, the youth employment rate declined for the first time in 6 months. So Statistics Korea reported a total of 28.39 million employed individuals last month, reflecting an increase of 173,000 compared to the same period last year. And this marks the lowest job growth since February 2021, a period heavily affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the peak in year-on-year job growth occurred in January 2022 with 1.13 million new jobs. And since then, the growth has tapered, hovering around 200,000 to 300,000 new jobs. Now, explaining the slower growth in March, Seo Jun-woo from the agency attributed it to a high base effect, as 469,000 jobs were created in March 2023, and the adverse weather conditions affecting the agriculture and fishing sector, which experienced a significant decline of 50,000 jobs, the largest drop since March 2017. However, the manufacturing sector saw an increase of 49,000 jobs, marking the fourth consecutive monthly rise due to strong export demand.
Remember, every time we talk about job growth and employment figures, it's also very important to look at the age demographics. You see a demographic shift contributing to the slower job growth. The number of people within the 15 to 64 years of age group, decreasing in recent years due to low birth rate and an aging population. So let's also break down the age demographics there.
Sure. According to the agency, the number of people aged 15 to 64 has decreased in recent years from a peak of 36.87 million in 2017 to 36.69 million in 2020, and then to 36.32 million in 2022, owing mostly to a low birth rate and a population aging. And as of last month, the number further dropped to 35.73 million. So by age group, the number of jobs for those aged 15 to 29 fell by 131,000, the greatest loss since July of last year. And people in their 40s also lost 79,000 jobs last month. However, employment for people over the age of 60 increased by 233,000 over the previous year. Now, the finance ministry noted that while the job market remains stable amid an export-driven economic recovery, weak domestic demand and reduced construction orders could pose challenges. So the government aims to closely monitor these factors and focus on creating high-quality job opportunities.
So if you're saying from 15 to 29, right? I mean, this is kind of like when you're really at the I don't want to say the peak of your job, but this is when you're really kicking off your career, right? You're making a turning point in your career, and the jobs losses are at 131,000 per on year. Very concerning. But even more concerning is the fact that those in their 40s, right? I mean, this is when you're like kind of supposed to be now really taking off on your career. You have a family potentially. You got, private institutions that you need to pay for, your kids' private education. You have to pay for this, and they're losing jobs. It's concerning here, and the only reason why you have those in their 60s and above gaining jobs is because they're part-time jobs. It's not full-time jobs, and the youth right now are struggling to get jobs right now. Really, really concerned. Again, hopefully we'll see a recovery in these figures too. Let's talk about national debt now.
Even more concerning.
National debt growing by nearly 60 trillion won to more than 1.1 quadrillion won. The growth rate of the national debt has been steeper than the growth rate of the GDP. The debt to GDP ratio has now exceeded over 50% for the first time ever. Hannah, more gloomy figures here. Let's get more on this.
Oh, that's right. Now, the government deliberated and approved the National Financial Report for fiscal year 2023 at the cabinet meeting on Thursday. And according to the report, the national debt reached a record high of 1.127 quadrillion won last year. It was 59.4 trillion won higher than the previous year. According to the Ministry of Finance, Strategy and Finance, the concept of fiscal deficit is cumulative, so the national debt and national liability keep increasing every year. Last month, the national debt to GDP ratio stood at 50.4%. This was 1 percentage point higher than the previous year. And in fact, this year is the first since the statistics began in 1982 that the debt to GDP ratio exceeded 50% on a year-end basis. Last year, the national liability stood at 2.439 quadrillion won, up 113.3 trillion won from the previous year.
I'm just kind of looking at the global GDP debt to GDP ranking. Luckily, if you look at some of the other countries, 50%, it's not considered very, very high. Although South Korea is kind of in the top end here now. Japan, by the way, has the highest debt to GDP ratio at roughly around 264%. It really is alarming. Venezuela, 241%. Sudan, 186%. Let's move on here. The Justice Ministry revealing Thursday night that an international tribunal has ordered South Korean government to compensate a U.S.-based hedge fund, Mason Capital, 43.8 billion won. Now, it sounds like a lot, but let's change that into U.S. dollars. 32 million U.S. dollars in connection with an investor-state dispute stemming from the highly controversial 2015 merger of two Samsung affiliates. Singa, let's get more on this.
Sure. The Permanent Court of Arbitration, or the PCA, in the Netherlands issued the ruling nearly 6 years after Mason Capital, headquartered in New York, initiated the dispute resolution process against the South Korean government, initially seeking $200 million US dollars in damages, but the awarded compensation represents approximately 16% of Mason's initial claim. And additionally, the tribunal mandated the payment of compound interest at a rate of 5% per annum on delayed payments from July 2015 until the date of the ruling, along with covering legal and arbitration expenses totaling 10.9 million US dollars. So overall, the government is estimated to owe Mason roughly 80 billion won. So the case stems back to the 2015 merger between Samsung C&T and Yeol Industries, which exchanged Yeol shares at a ratio of 0.35 for every Samsung C&T share. So Mason, holding a 2.18% stake in Samsung C&T, contested the merger, alleging undervaluation of the C&T shares, and subsequently filed the lawsuit in 2018, alleging undue government intervention in favor of the merger. Now, the merger, perceived as a move to consolidate control under Samsung heir Lee Jae-yong, was embroiled in a significant corruption scandal, resulting in the impeachment and conviction of former President Park Geun-hye, as well as Lee Jae-yong's imprisonment. Now, Mason accused the Park administration of exerting undue influence on the National Pension Service, a major Samsung C&T shareholder, which Mason considered pivotal in approving the merger. Now, Mason also claimed that the true purpose of the merger was to facilitate the succession within the controlling family and solidify its control, resulting in losses for Samsung C&T stockholders. So the decision marks the second time that the PCA has ruled against the South Korean government in connection with the merger by the Samsung affiliates. Now, last year, the tribunal ordered the government to pay approximately 53.59 million plus interest to Elliott Investment Management, which is a U.S. hedge fund that launched an arbitration complaint seeking $770 million in compensation.
Yeah, so I mean, it's fractions, right, compared to what they were asking for. And the argument that was going back and forth with Mason Capital and the South Korean government was quite interesting because, again, Mason Capital coming out saying, your former president, Park Geun-hye, literally convicted and impeached for the corruption scandal, and you're you're telling me that there was no involvement by the South Korean government in regards to this. Well, the government was arguing that the NPS works as an independent, service, although it's a state-run NPS, right? And so there's got to be this, or they're saying that there must have been some sort of influence by the government there. Also, the government was basically saying that it's true that former President Park Geun-hye received bribery, but it could not have been because of the merger of the CNT, Samsung CNT and Samsung Yeol Industries, because she received a bribe afterwards. And a lot of people are saying, well, I mean, you can receive the money afterwards, make sure that, goes through. And back and forth, but you're seeing, again, roughly around 16% of what Mason Capital was asking for being paid out, needs to be paid out now by Samsung Group. Moving on, the United Nations General Assembly, they were in session over Russia's vetoing of a resolution, UNSC resolution to extend the panel experts who monitor the implementation of these anti-North Korea sanctions. The South Korean government criticizing Russia for using their veto power to cover up its arms deal with North Korea. And North Korea said it was an illegal resolution, thanked Russia. That also shows that they're kind of working together here. Hannah, let's get more on this.
Sure. Now, when a permanent member of the UNSC vetoes a resolution, the chairman of the General Assembly must convene a meeting within 10 days. The meeting was called because Russia vetoed the extension of the panel of experts who have been monitoring the implementation of sanctions on North Korea on March 28th. Now, Russia's ambassador to the UN said he would submit a draft resolution as soon as possible that would extend the panel's term by 1 year, including a sunset clause on sanctions. And the consensus is that this is just a tactic to justify the veto. The South Korean ambassador to the UN, Hwang Jung-guk, accused Russia of using its veto power to gag the panel report on illegal arms trade with North Korea. And of course, North Korea said that it is very grateful to Russia for vetoing the illegal resolution. Now, the panel of experts was established in 2009 in the wake of North Korea's second nuclear test and has been monitoring the implementation of sanctions against North Korea and has been submitting annual reports related to it. And for the past 14 years, its mandate has been extended by 1 year through Security Council resolutions, but a Russian veto will bring it to an end on the 30th of April.
Yeah, so I mean, how do you go about okaying it, not using your veto power back in 2009 to now fast forward to 2024 and say that you're going to veto it? But also, I mean, not only would you say that this kind of is another evidence that North Korea and Russia are collaborating. There's some arms trade going on, but also for like Russia's perspective, right? I mean, they're kind of like buddies now. And they're the few buddies that they have in the global international community. So how do you go about not using their veto power when they've done so for years now? North Korea state media reporting on Friday that Zhao Leji, China's top legislator, held discussions with Choi Ryong-hae, a senior official from North Korea, focusing on enhancing bilateral relations as the two commemorate the 75th anniversary of their diplomatic ties. So yeah, let's get more on this.
Sure. During Zhao Leji's 3-day visit to Pyongyang, Zhao and Choi Ryong-hae explored ways to advance cooperation across various sectors encompassing politics, economy, and culture. And their talks were aimed at fortifying the long-standing bilateral relations between the two nations, as detailed by the Korean Central News Agency a day after Zhao's arrival for the opening ceremony of the North Korea-China Friendly Year. Now, the discussions also touch upon bilateral cooperation as well as shared concerns regarding regional and international affairs. However, specific details were not provided by the KCNA. And according to China's Foreign Ministry, Zhao, who serves as the chairman of the National People's Congress of China, expressed Beijing's desire to elevate high-level exchanges and deepen reciprocal cooperation with North Korea within the framework of the Friendship Year. So the visit witnessed the signing of cooperation agreements concerning mutual waivers of diplomatic visas, customs procedures, and quarantine measures. And notably, Zhao's visit marks the first by a high-ranking Chinese official to North Korea since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in early 2020. Also, the engagement between North Korea and China reflects a concerted effort by Pyongyang to bolster ties with Beijing, similar to its expanding relationship with Russia, which includes military collaboration. Now, South Korea's Unification Ministry suggested on Thursday that Zhao's visit could pave the way for a substantial improvement in bilateral relations, and there's speculation among observers about the potential for North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to visit China later this year for a potential summit with Chinese President Xi Jinping.
You know, earlier this week, I believe North Korean leader Kim Jong-un had made an on-site visit to a military academy named after his father, Kim Jong-il. And the KCNA was reporting on him kind of rallying up support of these soldiers and troops, the military academy, the young people at the military academy. And some of the pictures that were being released was inside a particular room where there was a number of maps. And there was a map that showed of South Korea. And there was the words that said, map of Puppet Korea or something like that. And there was also a map of what it said was Central Seoul. And so it was an indication, a message that they are continuously planning out certain military operations or warlike situations in South Korea. And it was a direct message to South Korea. Well, here is an interesting message coming from South Korea and the United States. They have confirmed plans to conduct a tabletop exercise simulating North Korea's use of a nuclear weapon as part of their efforts to strengthen their joint response to Pyongyang's continuous nuclear threats. Hannah, let's get more on this.
Sure. Now, the two sides had agreed to incorporate scenarios of nuclear operations into their regular summertime military exercise in a session of the Nuclear Consultative Group last December, although the Allies held their first TTX on nuclear weapon use by the North in February last year. It would mark the first time such training takes place in conjunction with the Ulchi Freedom Shield exercise in August. Now, the two sides also held in-depth discussions on cooperation for maintenance, repair, and overhaul capabilities in the Indo-Pacific region. And in addition, the two sides agreed to make efforts for a reciprocal defense procurement agreement that will provide reciprocal market access as part of efforts to enhance supply chain resiliency and strengthen defense cooperation. They also agreed to modernize the alliance with advanced technologies, noting that South Korea's recently launched military reconnaissance satellite contributes to their joint surveillance capabilities. The two sides stressed the importance of trilateral cooperation with Japan, and they agreed on the importance of preserving peace and stability in the Taiwan Strait, according to the statement.
Let's move on to some international news. A joint statement being issued on Thursday between the leaders of the United States, the Philippines, and Japan, where they reaffirmed the commitment to complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula while also condemning North Korea's escalating military threats. Singin, let's get more.
Sure. Following their first ever trilateral summit in Washington, President Joe Biden, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and the Philippines President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. issued a joint vision statement stating that Pyongyang's provocative actions have severe security implications for the Indo-Pacific and Europe. So the leaders reiterated their dedication to the complete denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and strongly criticized North Korea's series of provocative actions, including numerous ICBM launches, which they viewed as a grave threat to peace and security. Now, on China, they expressed serious worries about its dangerous and aggressive behavior in the South China Sea, while expressing their strong opposition to any unilateral moves by China to change the status quo in the East China Sea through force or coercion. So to enhance maritime cooperation, the three nations announced the establishment of a trilateral maritime dialogue and outlined plans for a joint maritime training activity around Japan in the coming year. Also, the leaders welcomed U.S.-led regional groupings, including the Trilateral Cooperation Framework involving South Korea, the U.S., Japan, as well as the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, comprising the U.S., Australia, India, and Japan as crucial elements for regional stability.
Since we're on the topic of some global news here, something to look over the weekend is, as you know, there's been an apparent attack by Israel, right? Israeli air attack on a consulate, Iranian consulate over in Damascus, and I believe there was a Wall Street Journal report that came out citing someone who spoke with one of the officials in Iran, saying that Iran is planning to launch an attack against Israel within 22 to 48 hours, although that has not been confirmed by other sources here, and so. This, again, could potentially spark another potential war. And again, if Iran and Israel gets involved with this, I mean, this is going to be disastrous for the region. And you're going to also see some sides being formed once again. So this is something that we'll keep a close tab on. But for now, guys, thank you very much for your updates. Have a safe weekend, and we'll see you guys again next week.
Thank you.
You can listen to Korea Now with me, SJ Lee, by downloading the Arirang radio application or tune in online by visiting www.arirangradio.com. So make sure you tune in Mondays through Fridays, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Korea time.